in order to get a better sense of who you all are, who are on with us today, we have a couple poll questions. And Allison, I'll invite you to pull up the first poll question. And the poll question is, which of the following best describes the setting where you engage in prevention strategies? And in order to respond to the poll questions, please select the option that best fits your work. And please take a moment to fill out these polls. In the survey that we do, engagement was a big piece that was requested, so the surveys allow us, or the polls allow us to get a better sense of your engagement, and so we can see where you are and who you're working with, and keep you kind of involved throughout our call. And those polls are loading on the screen. And it looks like the majority of you are a prevention agency, followed by community coalitions. And we've got some government entities as well as other. The other is a pretty small pot, so I can imagine that would be pretty broad. So for the majority of the folks that we have here today, really focused on prevention and community coalitions. So hopefully this will be giving you the tools that you need to really work through a thoughtful, planned process. Now for the next poll, the question is, what is your level of understanding of the Strategic Prevention Framework, or SPIF? And those questions will be coming onto your screen. So please take a moment to fill out those questions. And are we close to results? And those should be loading onto your screen shortly. And the primary answer is that you understand the basics, followed by I have seen the flower and heard it's important, which is an important piece, and I've been through extensive training on the SPIF. For those who have been on the extensive training for the SPIF or move over, I can teach it, this really isn't a session for you, but hopefully it will be something that will be for the individuals within your community who don't have such a strong understanding in the SPIF process. Really, this is just a broad overview. There's the Substance Abuse Prevention Skills Training, also known as SAPS, which is a 4-day intensive training on the Strategic Prevention Framework that was developed through SAMHSA. So this is just a very quick 60-minute version of that. So we're not going to go into depth in any one category. We will spend a bit more time on assessment than the other areas, since that seems to be the area where folks are most concerned with. But other than that, if you've got additional questions or need additional information, then we'll provide you with some resources kind of as we move along. Allison, we'll turn things over to you for your key principles.
Thanks so much, Derek. So as we take a look at the key principles that really underlie the SPIF and its development, it didn't start in nonprofit, didn't start in social services, and not in alcohol and drug abuse prevention. Really, the SPIF model is a basic planning model that has its groundings in business and was then morphed and formed to fit well with social services, nonprofit, and particularly substance abuse and mental health problem prevention. So it's a tested business model that has been found to work very well with coalitions and community engagement, but also certainly for prevention agencies and at funding levels for those of you that are funding agencies or with a governmental body. It is a data-driven process. That is the earmark of the SPIF, and a real cornerstone of it is that first step of assessment, with the focus on identifying intervening variables that tie to the research of what we know cause your problem that you're dealing with in your community based on the research, as well as then what your data tells you is those research-based risk or protective factors that are at play within your local conditions in your community. Those are what we would call intervening variables. All of that is then what drives the whole plan of the SPIF. So it's not assumption-driven, as we say. It's always data-driven. The SPIF also does emphasize outcomes-based prevention and does have that key step of evaluation that we're going to look at. So if we can look at the flower as a whole, You will see, those of you who have not seen or heard of this before, and we have to talk as if we do have folks on the line who've maybe never even seen what we call the flower. It may be obvious why we call it the SPIF flower. But SPIF, of course, again, stands for the Strategic Prevention Framework. We're likely to say SPIF a lot throughout this webinar, so just be sure you know what that stands for. As you take a look at the planning process, it really starts at the top in the red step, and we're going to go ahead and break down each of these steps here and take a look at how they all play out. So assessment being the first, because again it is a data-driven process. That's where we profile our population needs and resources and take a look at the readiness of our community. Are they ready to act as a community or to receive these kinds of services? Are they ready for the change that you are planning? Because if you don't meet your community where it's at with the right strategy at the right time, you could be spinning your wheels and wasting a lot of time and precious resources. So we want to definitely take a look at that, as well as assessing the gaps within our community. Some of those gaps that may come in may actually come through things like capacity, and that's the next step, that you also need to assess and take a look at your capacity and build your capacity before you can put a plan in place. So how do we mobilize and build the capacity we need to address needs? That's not just people power, and that's not just money. We'll take a look at capacity in depth when we get to that step. The third step of the SPIF is planning, and that is where we do get all the right people in the room who bring perspective. We're using that data, we're using that capacity to come up with the just-in-time, right next step plan that is meeting our community where it's at now and moving them where they need to go. So a strategic plan that's 1 to 3 years could have a little longer of a vision, particularly for some of the more coalition-y, large-scale work, but needs to also have planning for now. And then that gets actualized in the next step in implementation, where we don't just implement the activities, but we put meat of the bones on the plan and create an action plan that takes the current day planning stuff from our strategic plan and puts more meat on the bones with a task planner and an action planner so that we can get going and then do the actual implementation, which leads us to our fifth step of the SPIF, which is evaluation, where we are continually monitoring our progress, evaluating our successes and our outcomes, ideally at the population level. We're sustaining and improving our processes and our outcomes, and anything that doesn't seem to be working for us, we hopefully have gathered enough clear information about what isn't working, but also ideally why it may not be working, so that we can make an adjustment and be more successful as we go back around again, because you're going to go round and round and round the SPIF. Once you enter, you don't get out, right? If you're doing the SPIF well and right, you go round that circle multiple times. You may have also noticed that in that center there's that sustainability and cultural competence piece, and that they have a piece within every petal of the flower. They overlap with all of it. So let's take a minute and look at what the framers of the Strategic Prevention Framework mean when they say sustainability, because it is more than just funding. It's also about sustaining our outcomes and not our programs. And particularly for those of you that are doing coalition work, that's important to keep in mind, first and foremost, just because coalitions aren't really program providers. So we covered that in our webinar last month, and if you didn't get a chance to see that, no, it is on our YouTube channel, and you can download or take a look at that presentation about making a case for coalition and understanding how coalitions differ from a prevention program. But even those of you using the SPIF or prevention program, the sustainability isn't about sustaining the program for program's sake. It's about sustaining our outcomes. So the program doesn't necessarily have to live if the outcomes are living on. So it really is going to depend on the design of your program. Sustainability is also about making those formal and structural linkages so that relationships may live on. So like coalitions may get 2 or 3 different systems working together in a different way, creating memorandums of understanding so that they're streamlining a process, and that may have been what created a community level change, and that can live on even when the coalition is gone. Sustaining that. Sustaining champions and leadership that will continue to make these changes in these same directions within their community sector and across sectors, that sustainability, as is administrative policies and procedures. Certainly want to sustain the expertise of our community and, of course, the community ownership, not only of the problem but of the solution as well. Sustainability, then, when we talk about why is it important, you've got a couple thoughts that we've put together here that really if the problem still exists or can reoccur, then it's not time to end that strategy that's achieving positive results, right? So we need to be able to sustain our efforts over time. It's also easier to sustain a successful effort than to have it prematurely end and then have to start all over again and come together again later. Because some of your community folks, especially within community coalition work, are going to be like, didn't we already all come together and do this? I thought we got it done, right? So you don't want to take the foot off the pedal too soon, the foot off the gas too soon. But you might be able to lighten it and not have as much gas on it and still be able to sustain that outcome while putting more of your energy and effort to another direction and have a simultaneous direction going that you're doing planning and change in, but you're not letting your foot off the gas of your original efforts because they need to be sustained in some way. I hope that makes sense as an analogy, a little car analogy for us. So also in the center of the SPIF flyer was not just sustainability, there was also cultural competence. And cultural competence gets talked about all the time. It gets kicked around as a phrase, and I think it gets talked about how it's important more than it is actuated most of the time in most people's practices. So when we're talking about cultural competence, we're talking about attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are related, in our example, to ATOD problems and how they develop and develop within cultural contexts. You may have a different problem that you're applying this SPIF to. For our strategies to be appropriate and effective, for all the target populations, we do have to take into account people's diverse needs, their diverse styles, their diverse values, their beliefs. And if you think about, let's just try that on even just with assessment briefly. Is your data being collected in a culturally competent way? Are you getting data across the diversity of your community? And whoever's looking at that data as a data group, is the lens at which they look at it culturally competent? Is the analysis of the data being culturally competent? Are we making sense of it in a way that takes into account the diversity of the community and what these things may be telling us? So it is important that the people at the table also reflect the diversity of your community. That helps make your assessment, for example, be more culturally competent. So, you know, why do you need to consider all of that cultural competence throughout the SPIF? Well, certainly we need to consider them in the project planning and implementation, and not just in the assessment that I gave the example of, because you got to meet your community where it's at. That's your whole community, everyone in your community. And diversity and cultural competence, if at all you're picturing visual diversity, and maybe that's a racial diversity, that is one small slice of the diversity pie. There are so many ways we have to look at diversity in our community, everything from socioeconomic, education level, generational things that may be in play. I've worked in communities where there are the townies and then there's the rural, and that one pocket of their community may even be Mennonite. And where is that coming from, as a community and as a culture around this issue? So that's got to be taken into account when we look at our programs, our policies, and our practices that we choose and plan. And we also want to certainly eliminate any service or participation disparities in the work that we do. So that's another reason why cultural competence needs to be in every step of the SPIF. So I'm going to take a minute here and step into our first step of the SPIF assessment in a little more of a detailed way, but I want to underline again what Derek said right at the top of the webinar. This is an overview. We could do 6 hours, a whole week on assessment. This is a 45-minute webinar, of which assessment is a small sliver. So I'm going to give you a very bird's eye view of this issue. And also let you know that there is, another car analogy. You could do the Mini Coupe version of assessment and still be more data-driven than assumption-driven, and that's still progress, and that's better planning then. It's more data-driven. But you also could do the moving van semi-truck version of assessment and have so much data, almost to the point it's overwhelming, that it's hard to make sense of it all, and then really find those patterns to help direct your planning, and everything in between. So assessment can really scale big to small. So let's go ahead and take a look at why we do assessment. Hopefully everyone understands the importance of data because data and assessment is going to answer the most important question for you, and that is what's going on in our community. And to break that down a little bit more, if again we use substance abuse as our example, you can plug in other problems as you need to. We're going to use substance abuse as our example today. How big and what type of problem do we have in our community? What's supporting these substance abuse problems in our community? What does research tell us are contributing factors to it across any community, and what seems to be in play in our community? What resources currently exist in our community that are addressing these identified problems related to substance abuse, and how ready is our community for change, for prevention? Now, you might, when you go, you yourself may have some of these thoughts, or you may, when you go to present spiffing and taking the time to do assessment to your community, you may get some pushback. And very often, if you think back to that spiff flower, people want to jump straight to the implementation, to the activity or strategy stage and the doing stage. And you may have people who are really tied in and wanting to act now. We have a crisis, we need to act now, we've got to do damage control. So you may need to help make a case for why we need to slow down and do assessment, at least a mini coupe version, if nothing else, of assessment. So you may hear things like, we don't need to do all this. We already know the problems in our community. Let's just start some action. And maybe you and your group do have a good thumb, on the pulse. So I guess that's not a good, you always use that phrase, but you're not supposed to use a thumb for your pulse. So maybe you have a good finger on the pulse of your community, and you really know what's going on and knows what the problems are. And honestly, if the building's is burning, put out the fire. That it may be obvious, but very often the needs are not as clear as we think, and we're making a lot of assumptions about what's really going on or why it's going on. And you got to know what kind of fire it is too. That you don't put out an oil fire with water. So you got to know what you're dealing with. So you and everyone else in your group and in your community can have a lot of opinions and a lot of biases, and you may actually not be on the same page about what's going on in community and why it's happening to know how to address those contributing factors. If you really talk to each other, you may find you don't have consensus, and data is the way to find the objective truth. Wouldn't it be worth checking out what other people think and getting some hard data to help clarify, what's really going on, so that you don't spin your wheels and end up off the mark? Now, another pushback you might get from your community is something like, hey, we're busy, and again, take off the leash. We want to get going, quit holding us back. And it's not just always about, trying to get them to understand the importance of knowing what you want to do is really meeting a true community need, that you're being data-driven versus assumption-driven. You need to then, if they're focused on how busy we are, talk about, well, then we don't want to waste our time, do we? We don't want to spin our wheels doing the wrong thing and lose a lot of time and energy and precious resource dollars. If you do have some dollars funding your effort, they're precious dollars, in particularly our field. And also the other thing to keep in mind around capacity and change, you need the community to own the problem, so you got to be able to describe the scope of the problem to the community. But as you get other people, movers and shakers, involved in your effort, you've got to be able to make the case and demonstrate the scope of the problem to get other people to your table and to be part of your effort. So assessment as overall, a quick summary in my mind of what assessment really is, because everyone gets really bogged down. Data, and I'm not a real data head. There are many other people that are colleagues of mine that I see as much bigger data heads than I am. But I do like watching crime detective shows. So what I've started really making the analogy of is, this is really about all of us getting in touch with our inner detective, becoming curious, asking questions, but why? Why? But why is that happening here? What does the research say? What does our data say when we put it next to that research base? What's happening in our community? So we're going to give you a quick summary slide of all the kinds of areas you could be doing some assessment around. We will not be going into these beyond this slide, except a little bit on two of them today, because this is an overview. Again, you could do a day-long training on assessment and true needs assessment and all the possible tools that are out there and the resources that are available to you through things like the Community Toolbox website and through CATCA and if you've got your own evaluator, phenomenal. So we'll talk a little bit about assessing needs a little bit today. We're not going to spend time today, but you do want to take a look at finding out more information about demographic and geographic features. For example, I never would have thought of this when it came to teenage underage drinking parties until someone pointed out that here in Columbus we have a lot of basements. There are other areas in Ohio that don't. So it's like, oh, well, basement parties, we just assume is what's always going on, you know, and it's like, oh, so that's a difference of a geographic feature. Are there areas of your community where there's more basements or a lot of empty houses due to the housing crash, and are some parties going down at empty houses? We've known kids to crawl into empty houses and throw their party there. So geographic features, that's just one example. Assessing your policies, both formal laws, regulations, codes, community codes, things in your zoning commission, everything from parking, you know, if there's no parking in front of the party house, then all the cars can't pile up there without being towed away. So that's a great example. So what are your codes, formal, informal, policies as well, workplace policy, school policy, athletic policies? Are they sufficient? Are there gaps in them? Assessing existing services and resources. What's already out there? Who's already addressing this issue? We don't want to duplicate something that's already happening. We want to coordinate all those efforts and or fill gaps that have been going unmet. And so assessing those gaps within all of this is going to be important. And then assessing readiness, which we will spend a little bit of time talking about today. So very briefly, when we talk about assessing needs, we're talking things like prevalence data. How often is this occurring? Which, if, for example, with substance abuse, what drugs are being most used? Incidence data, when we're looking at first use of drugs, what age is that at? What drug is that first use? Consequence data, all that piece around legal consequences, you know, the DUI, the charges for selling to a minor for, you know, for a bar or a carryout. Consequence data in schools, you know, emergency rooms. So what are the consequences of the problem? How are they showing in our community? And if we make change, we should see that data go down. Lots of different sources for this kind of information. You can certainly get a lot through surveys, not just of your youth. If you're focused on underage use or youth drug problems, it's still important to survey adults in your community and parents as well. Focus groups in an adolescent treatment program, for example, might be something to try if you don't have the money for a full-blown survey. And what were their drugs of first use, and et cetera? What's their view of what's going on out there? Data from a health department or law enforcement or juvenile court, juvenile probation. Lots of data exists already out there. It just may not have been gathered in a pretty way. And maybe that's what, for example, a coalition can do, is help put that data, create kind of a clearinghouse for all that data where it could get sorted and become useful instead of just being locked up in a computer somewhere. Of course, within all of this, you have to ensure your cross-cultural representation. So up there in the green arrow, I want to point out, we will, when we send you the link to the recording of this webinar, we're going to include some handouts for you. And that will include, by the way, a handout of all these slides. And it will include also a little handout called A to Z, Community Level Indicators, that is kind of a nice little list you can pick and choose from to see, you know, what could we easily gather in our community that could be meaningful and tell part of the story. So as you assess needs, you know, how do we currently get our information? That's a great question. Is this been culturally competent and cross-cultural in how we get our information and how we analyze it? What data are we missing? How could we get it? How could we fill the gaps? So we always want to be asking those questions over and over and over and over and over, and I believe over again. So I think that's very, very important piece of this. Let's go ahead and take a look at community readiness very briefly. This, again, could be its own workshop, but for those of you who've not heard the term before, community readiness is the extent to which a community is prepared to address substance abuse prevention problems or whatever your chosen problem is. So let's take a look first more at why this is important. Readiness is going to be important for a community. Again, for change to take place, you have to have the community's support. You have to have commitment, particularly from gatekeepers and stakeholders and key community leaders, and there have to be resources. But the community at large also has to be ready for the change. So you may plan activities that are so beyond what your community can embrace, it was too much too soon. So if you know your stage of readiness, you can better plan a just-in-time activity or strategy that will meet your community where it's at. So there is 9 stages. There are 9 stages of community readiness that have been identified, not by us, and unfortunately I don't have that right in front of me where these came from, but they are on the handout that we will be sending you. It is referenced where that came from, so if you want to do some further reading on it, you can. So there are 9 stages of community readiness. It'll be a 2-sided handout, or 2-page handout actually, is what you'll be sent from us. And that might be a big kernel in your bunny trail of other things to follow up on to learn more. Of course, to assess your community readiness, you could look down those stages and go, wow, I think our community's in denial. And your whole community planning group may agree. But it might be smarter to get an objective look at that. And there are some tools to help you assess community readiness. Highly recommend triethnic community readiness. If you just even make a note of that now, you don't do it now, but Google later. They have an excellent process on their website that you can download their handbook and just go off on your own and try to do it. You could get training from them and still do it yourself. You could work with them and divide the tasks, or you could just hand it all over to them and they do it all for a fee. So there's a whole buffet and different fee structure if triethnic is going to help you to measure your community's readiness for change. There's also a Community Partner Institute Community Prevention Readiness Index you may want to Google and look up more. Goodman and Wandersman has a Community Key Leader Survey, whereas well, and really triethnic is a key leader survey as well, where you identify key leaders across community sectors, so they're both a key leader approach. Now, very specific to underage drinking and to law enforcement, the Underage Drinking Enforcement Training Center, that is what UDEC stands for. Again, that was the Underage Drinking Enforcement Training Center. They have a sample law enforcement survey, which is also a nice way, just specific to underage drinking, to get an idea about where's your law enforcement's readiness to, and how much do they believe in and enforce the underage drinking laws as they already stand in your community. So that's an important piece of that as well. So that's a very quick rundown on just an overview of the kinds of things you would need to spend some time and energy around an assessment. Derek's going to take over and talk to us more about the next couple steps.
Thank you, Allison. And as Allison mentioned, we are going to be looking at building upon the previous flowers or the petals of the spiff. So she talked about assessment, and the next step of that is capacity. And when we're looking at capacity, we're really looking to see what would be needed for a community to be successful in reaching the goals that they set, in building that capacity for their community, and see what resources are available. And when we think of resources, we really want to look at not just money, but all the other things that the communities have available at their disposal. We want to look at building the knowledge of our staff and our coalition members to make sure that they're empowered and skilled to really effectively address the problem. And while money can be an important piece, it's not the be-all, end-all. And a lot of times we see very strong community coalitions who work through and get a grant from DFC or something, and then we see that the partners in the coalition start falling off because, well, they've got somebody paid to do that, and they don't need to be involved anymore. So money can be helpful, but it can also be a detriment to coalitions. So that's really where it's important to have a good sense of what your organization, your community, and your coalition capacity is. So if you do have those financial resources, then you can work to make sure that they're integrated appropriately, so it just doesn't become the job of that paid staff person to do it, because that's going to really hurt you when it comes to your sustainability, which is consistent throughout the process. If you've got that grant, you get your DFC, you run through your DFC cycle, that funding goes away, and so goes your partners and the efforts that you have underway. And you also want to look at capacity and see what resources you have or abilities you have to fill gaps within your community and to build on some of those structures that you have. You also want to look at the expertise of the coalition members that you have. Looking at the table, what can they bring? and everyone has different skills when you look at members of your coalition, and some of the skills are obvious. If you've got an attorney that's involved in your coalition, then that legal expertise might be an important piece, but he might have some other involvement through a civic organization that could help with the financial piece or other assets that you might not know about. So when you're thinking about capacity, don't just think about what you see on the surface within your coalition or your group, but think really beyond that. Also think about the capacity you have within your partners to get you some of that data. Do you work with law enforcement? Is there crime statistics that they can provide you with? What about your hospitals? Are there data that can kind of help with there? Do you have business partners that could help, not necessarily give you money, but the money could be an important piece, but route you to opportunities to get money or to have in-kind donations that kind of can assist you? And also looking at the coalition's reputation within the community. If there's a perception within the community that your coalition is out to be the wet blanket, then that's going to really be a challenge that you're going to have to work against. So you want to have a strong reputation of not being the wet blanket and trying to prevent everything, but really looking at improving the entire community and doing so by making the citizens of the community healthier. And enthusiasm is a huge piece of that. And as Alice mentioned earlier with the assessment piece, some folks are really interested in just doing, and don't see the value in the planned process. While the enthusiasm is needed throughout each stage of the SPIF process and throughout the life of your coalition. And you can use that enthusiasm to keep people charged and moving forward. And it's an important piece as we look at all stages of the SPIF flower to use that enthusiasm and really celebrate the successes that you have. Don't focus solely on the end goal, but really celebrate the little pieces that you have along the way. You also want to look at your community stakeholders. Who are affected by the problem? A thing that we say commonly within the SAPS training, which is the Substance Abuse Prevention Skills Training, is nothing about me without me. So look at those community stakeholders, see who's being affected by the problem, and make sure that they're working with you to help solve the problem. So you're not determining that your strategies or your intervention tools will be kind of thrust upon a population that's not really ready for it. Readiness is a big piece of that capacity, and making sure that you have those players involved so you can really be culturally competent in what their needs are. And really focus those resources and have them contribute towards the solution. So everybody's kind of working together and moving in the same direction. And when we look at the folks that we have people of influences, and they can be at various levels. There can be formal or informal. So if you're working with law enforcement or a chief of police, that can be a formal memorandum of understanding that you have between the two organizations. Or if you're working with a city prosecutor, I was talking to a coalition, and one of the challenges that they have is that their city prosecutor can't sit on their coalition because of how they're funded. So while they're not a formal member of that coalition, they're an informal partner and can kind of provide information and guidance for the coalition. But you're not going to see them on the roster for the coalition meeting because that just kind of fits outside of the scope of what they're able to do within their government. And look at a diverse cross-section for your community. So you don't just want to sit around the table and have everybody look like you. And as Allison had mentioned also, that when we're looking at that cross-section of your community and diversity, we're not just talking about ethnicity, but there are so many different layers of diversity that should really be considered to make sure that we've got folks that are engaged at all levels. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the community wheel, and this is an example of a community wheel. When you look at DFC funding or other community coalition grants, having the 12 sectors of the community represented is a strong piece. So this is an example of what a community wheel would look like. Some of the sectors may vary depending on the community wheel that you're familiar with, but this is a good cross-sector of the big pieces of the community and folks that should be coming to the table to help you with your efforts. And you should also think about it as a what's in it for them as well. So when you're looking to engage law enforcement, for example, what can we provide law enforcement that would be a benefit to them for being involved with your coalition? Are there fundings available for compliance checks or other things related to that? Or is the efforts of the coalition going to have a large impact on the community in which the law enforcement efforts won't have to be so focused in one area? So if your community, the biggest issue of the community is related to opiate abuse and specifically heroin, if you work as a coalition to change that community norm, then that takes some of the pressure off of law enforcement to address their efforts in other ways. So also think about connecting with the folks in the community and thinking about what's in it for them as to why they should be involved with your efforts, because everyone's time is extremely important. Think about the capacity and change how they operate. Look at those structures and linkages, and law enforcement is a prime example of being territorial and maybe not always integrating so well with one another. So if that's the case, really change how they operate. Have those formal MOUs and be the liaison between your sheriff and your police department, so you can help bridge those gaps and make those connections. So it's not a us versus them, but it's everybody really working together. And that's really going to help you transform your system or the sectors of your community so that it really is more of a partnership and less of siloed efforts where everybody's kind of just walking on top of one another. And be those champions, the partners, and the change agents. You can be great champions and cheerleaders for your community, and that will help you kind of get more community interest and buy-in. Will also help gathering some of those additional partners. So if you get good media coverage from the efforts that you're doing, then that's going to enhance the partners that are wanting to be associated with you. And that's going to lead you to additional change agents that are going to help you move your mission along to where you want it to go. And when we're thinking about coalitions, particularly when we have those grants and making sure that all sectors of the coalition are engaged, a lot of times we feel that we have to get people there and sit around the table and just check them off the list. So you meet monthly, you have your turkey sandwich, and you talk about what you're working on, and there's not really a whole lot of collaboration. Think instead of your coalition more of rings of involvement. And this is a great example of from how to make collaboration work and the rings of involvement. So if you've got someone that's engaged or interested but doesn't have the time commitment to come to every coalition meeting, that's okay. There's different levels of involvement for different people. So if you've got chief of police, for instance, whose time is very valuable and might be a little stretched, it's important to have them engaged, but not necessarily to attend every piece of that coalition. So you can kind of read through the various levels and get additional information from David Strauss to really talk about what that looks like. Throughout all sections of the SPIF, we're doing the capacity check to think about what don't we know and ask those partners about what that might look like, along with what relationships are missing, how we can be more culturally competent or be more inclusive to others, who else has a vested interest that's not being engaged or has not been engaged fully, and looking at some of that data and resources that might be missing for your community. After you've looked at the assessment, building from the capacity, the next step of SPIF is planning. And when we look at what we do as professionals, we do a little bit of planning and a whole lot of implementation a lot of times. So kind of pulling back a little bit, thinking about what planning might look like, creating that objective profile of your community, and acting with intent instead of being reactive. A lot of times we see pressures from communities and we're forced to react, and when we do so, we can't necessarily do so in a planful way. Also, when we're looking at planning, we want to be thoughtful against just guessing about what we think might be the situation. And that's really where we need to lay into the data that we have and the capacity of our community to determine what's going to be best. So we want to also identify how to focus resources and efforts most wisely. And there's a common phrase that we hear a lot in prevention is, if it impacts just one, it's going to be worth it. Well, when we're looking at limited dollars and resources, for me, just one isn't isn't enough. We want to maximize those dollars in the most effective and efficient way, and why impact just one when if we tweak some things we can impact hundreds. So that's really where we want to focus on. And when you look at planning, it should produce strategic goals that lead to measurable objectives that then trickle down to performance targets and lead to then strategies that are being addressed. So the activity is not the goal. The outcome of the activities in the process is really the goal that you want to reach in order to have the greatest impact for your community. And we can do this through a word that often, or a phrase, I guess, that often elicits a lot of stress, and that is logic models. So we're not going to ask the question about how much you all love logic models, but through the trainings we've done, we've got a pretty good sense that the majority of people are not so favorable of logic models. And if that's the case, that's probably because logic models haven't been done well with you or within your communities, because logic models really are a necessary piece to the planning process. Because what it does is it builds from the needs assessment and makes that connection with your strategic planning, so you're able to bring the pieces together. And without that, then you're just going to go back to guessing. And there are benefits of a logic model, and not all logic models are the same, and they don't all look alike. They develop understandings. They help you monitor the progress that you're doing. It helps you with evaluation. There's a lot of things that logic models do. The biggest piece to consider when thinking about your logic model is, does it make sense? Because if the logic model isn't logical, then that's a poor logic model. And in communities that we work with, and with a lot of grant funding that kind of throws it along the way, not necessarily is the logic model logical. And logic models vary broadly. It can be based on funder to funder. So if you're funded through United Way, their logic model might be different than if you're funded through single state authority. So there's a lot of differences that you might see there. And if you have federal funding, then there's other impacts. And it will differ from training to training. So if you go to a SPIF training and they talk about logic model, it might be different than another SPIF training that you have thinking about logic model. But the key component to the logic model is, if it's a good logic model, it will get you from where you are to where you want to be. And it also should be something that you could walk up to a stranger that has no knowledge or background of the efforts that you're trying to make, show them your logic model, and have it make sense to them. Because if it doesn't, then it's not a good logic model. So this is a very simple logic model that SAMHSA has developed, and it's the 3-box headset, so it's very basic. And the focus of the logic model is to look at the problems that you have within your community. For our efforts, they're the ones that are focused specifically on substance abuse and other related problems. Look at the risk and protective factors or the conditions that might impact the substance abuse and related problem, and consider the programs, policies, and practices that you wish to implement on a local level to work for that. So the programs, policies, and practices are going to have an impact on the risk and protective factors or the conditions, as will the substance abuse and related problems. So you want to make sure that you're working appropriately to have the greatest impact. And it's important when you're doing so that you're doing it at a local level so you can have local level change. And having the programs, policies, and practices, we want to make sure from a cultural competency perspective that they really are focused on your local community and the conditions of the community, so that it's going to be something that will be effective. Not necessarily is a NREP certified box program going to work for your community, and there's going to be challenges if your community kind of proceeds with that misperception. So with the planning piece, just kind of doing a capacity check again. These are the same questions that we do through each level. What don't we know? Have we been culturally competent? Who else has a vested interest? What data and resources are we missing? These are things that you should do through with your community coalition or your group, task force, etc., kind of at all steps as you go through. And then the fun part is the implementation piece. And the implementation is really what brings it all together from what you're working on to that point. So as we move along, again, we're building from assessment to capacity to planning, and implementation is really what we're good at. So with that, we want to really look at making sure that when we're implementing, we're doing so in a thoughtful way based on the 3 previous steps that we'd worked on. So when we're developing our implementation, do we have action plans for implementing your policies, programs, and practices? And if so, are you implementing those policies, programs, and practices in a thoughtful and a strategic way? And are you doing so within a strategic plan? And while strategic plans don't necessarily relate in as much stress as the logic models do, we hear a lot of times that strategic plans are kind of stress-invoking as well. So, and they shouldn't be. So a basic strategic plan can be implemented in a variety of ways, but very concisely, when you're looking at a strategic plan and action planning, you want to look at who you want to impact, who will do what, by when, what resources do you need, and who else should know about what you're doing. So these are the very basic pieces that you need in order to put together an action step plan or a strategic plan to kind of get you moving to where you want to go. So again, we want to remember to ensure cultural needs. We want to make sure that they're relevant and that we've got the right players at the right pieces to kind of move that along. And if you go through your plan and it's not working out, the great thing about the SPIF is that we don't expect that what you think is going to be the issue, if there's changes or adjustments that need to be made, that they're not done. They need to be done immediately so you can kind of make your tweaks and move along. So you're not going to stay the course if you're off track. You're going to get back on the rails and move to where you want to go. I use train analogies. Allison uses car analogies. Either way, it's mobile. Hopefully we're moving in the right direction. So that's kind of the last bit of implementation. So you've got all your pieces working together, and we've got our cogs here, and the people kind of moving those cogs. And if one cog falls out, then we're not going to be successful at moving forward. So just kind of a visual illustration to show you the importance of having everybody move together and really focus on getting towards where you want to go. And that was implementation. Again, we do implementation pretty well and want to look at the resources that are available to you. So those are kind of the capacity, planning, and implementation as a quick overview. And Allison will take on the other stress-inducing component of evaluation.
I did just want to point out, we are doing a capacity check at the end of every step, and I always say this in a room, and I've never said it in a recorded way, but we sometimes think that capacity should be in the center of the SPIF because you have to have capacity to assess, you have to have capacity to plan, you need capacity to see it through, you need capacity to do your evaluations. So that's why we've put these kinds of questions with every step of the SPIF, because these are the questions you should be asking every step along the way. So the next and final step in the SPIF is the evaluation. It is, I believe, the orange petal on our flower. And evaluation is where we monitor, evaluate, sustain, improve, and replace things that fail. So if we're looking at the SPIF, again, as a circle, and it's not aligned, there's a reason why it's in this circular flower, is that evaluation takes us right back to assessment. And we're comparing our results with our baseline and seeing what we've moved and what we haven't moved. And is anything in our evaluation going to tell us why that didn't move? Is there some further capacity we need to build to go back then and adjust both our plan and therefore our implementation, and then let's evaluate that again. So we go round and round, right? All right, so in a good way. And sometimes I talk about the SPIF flower as a pinwheel. Are you ready? Okay, everybody get ready to just go, oh my God, gag. All right, so it's a pinwheel. And your efforts are blowing the winds of change through that pinwheel, and it's going round and round. See? Okay, y'all gagged. All right, so evaluation, why do we do it? Basically, evaluation, as we all know, would tell us what works, and also, of course, sometimes even more importantly, what doesn't work, what areas to improve, and ideally, if it's a well-designed evaluation, it'll tell us how to improve it. It'll give us hints to that. So during the evaluation step, just very briefly, of course, some of the key steps you're going to do, which again, there could be a whole workshop just on each of these bullets, collecting and analyzing your evaluation data, and really your logic model and your assessment data help design your evaluation plan. So you should already have been clear what data you're gathering and checking against, and putting your logic model ends up driving all of this. you're doing any written evaluation reports, whether that's for a funder, for community stakeholders, for your leadership planning team, for your coalition as a whole, if you're within an agency, for your funder, for your boss, for your board of directors, how are we doing? Where do we need to make change? So those evaluation reports can be very, very up in the balloon, lay of the land general, or they could be down in the weeds detail, depending on who your audience for those different evaluation reports is. Recommending then quality improvements then based on the data is your final step in the evaluation that takes you back around to the beginning of the SPIF again. So I think I already implied it, but here's a nice visual that shows us that logic models do bridge not only assessment to planning, as Derek already mentioned, but planning back to evaluation. And so that logic model really ties all of this very well together. And evaluation, I'm sure many of you have already had some workshops or training on evaluation. Again, very bird's eye view overview here. There are two general types of evaluation that you do want to be sure you're looking at. Certainly outcome evaluation is very crucial. How well are our strategies working within our plan to reduce our identified problem? And that's community and population level outcomes. But you can't dismiss the importance of process. It's not just whether we're meeting our outcomes, so that's crucial, but if we're falling short on our outcome, it may be due to our process, honestly. So we've got to be able to evaluate our process and how well we're working together, and how will we ensure that our strategies are designed in a way that they're getting the job done. So sometimes people think of process evaluation as how many things we did, and that's a very simplistic way to look at it. It's, within coalition, it's also the quality of our coalescing. What are the quality of our partnerships? How do we handle conflict? Is there inclusivity? Is there inclusivity in decision making, or is it being driven by only 2 or 3 people and everyone else is, consigned to donut eating? And that's about it. Is there role? Is there a seat warmer? That's not true coalition. So when we're looking at process, it comes hand in hand. The quality of your outcome will be about the quality of your process. So you've got to be willing to look at both. And sometimes as a group, take a look in a mirror. If you're more of in an agency, that can also be about agency management, planning, leadership, your strategic plans for the short term, the long term. Are you sticking to your mission, or are you kind of all over the place? Important things like that. Capacity check. When it comes to evaluation, those same key questions we've encouraged you to ask at the end of every step. I think evaluation had the least slides for what is usually the most content when we talk about the SPIF, but we knew we'd be coming toward the end of our webinar and wanted to also just acknowledge that for those of you new to the SPIF, you need to see where you're going and how it all folds together, but you're going to spend the majority of your time, of course, up there in those first few steps. So we wanted to put more of our time there. But if we come back to looking at the SPIF as a whole, and Derek will click through for us and get all 5 of those steps back up, I want you to reflect on that, and in a bit we're going to come to you with a question about this, and we may even come back there to slide 50 when we show that question, but ideally you guys have a sense of the SPIF and the order of it. But before we do, actually no, let's go ahead. I guess we're ready to ask that question now, aren't we? So we want you guys to use your chat box, or your question box, the way that we really want you to do it. So those of you that have been raising your hand or throwing a question at us, keep using that. You'll find it on your dashboard for GoToWebinar. And we just want some of your thoughts about why do you think the SPIF flower or the steps of the SPIF are in that order? And another way to ask that question is really, what could go wrong if you skipped a step and didn't follow the order? So what's the value of SPIF being in that order? And some of you may have had some personal experiences on a coalition or in an agency utilizing the SPIF or doing planning without the SPIF and went, well, God, if we'd followed the SPIF, then all that wouldn't have happened, right? So let's go ahead and see if there's anybody. Be sure you're using your question box. I don't know if folks are using chat. Nope. Does anyone have any thoughts that you could throw into the question box about why the SPIF is in that order? Oh, here we go. Hearing from Chelsea, it makes logical sense that the steps are in this order. Each step certainly builds upon the last. Thank you, Chelsea. Certainly, I also love Nancy's point that to ensure that the efforts are data-driven and not based on what we think is the right thing to do, which can, get us in trouble sometimes. Marcia talked about that you need to know what the problems and issues are before you can start planning and not make assumptions. It's a logical process. People are seeing the logic in it. The order makes it more organized. Like the idea that it's a circle, emphasis that it's an ongoing process. Nicole talked about many people in coalitions have a lot of great ideas. Oops, I lost. You guys have so many questions coming in. I've lost hers. Have a lot of great ideas and want to implement things right away. Putting them in this order will help slow the process down and look at each step that needs to happen before a project or program is implemented. Nicely done, Nicole. Oh, Chris, it's almost in the order we do things in our general life of planning. Yeah, that's why we make that analogy to business model planning. It's like, I call it the no-duh, right? I think sometimes people hear SPIF and they get so overwhelmed and they think it's this big, heavy, heavy thing. And the reality is you can do SPIF light or SPIF intense. Either way, it's going to be better than not SPIFing at all. And the SPIF intense, people may have heard people going through maybe like a state incentive grant 5-year process with the SPIF and think the SPIF always means that intense and overwhelmed. They had a lot of resources and a lot of support and help in those states to really do the Cadillac version of the SPIF. But again, you can do SPIF light and you're still going to do better than just being assumption driven. So the more we SPIF, the more comfortable we get with the SPIF and the easier it is to apply it to everything that we do. A lot of folks just really talking about they've used it before and it's been a great tool for them, whether it was grant required or not. A whole lot of different feedback here. Wendy emphasizing not jumping right to implementation. Yeah. All right, so it sounds like a lot of folks coming up with the same thing. But importance of not being rushed so that you forget a step or become ineffective. That's the key. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at some resources because this is a very brief overview of, again, what could be a very intensive process, as intense as you want to make it. So we want to point to some great resources. SAMHSA.gov/SPIF has a lot of links to it to help, especially if you're also introducing new people to the SPIF. There's some nice layman's overview as well as you can start to drill down deeper. For those of you that are coalitions, certainly we'd recommend if you've never been through a CATCA Coalition Academy, that is the in-depth Cadillac version of really digging in and rolling your sleeves up, and you get homework, and it's like a week away from home, 3 different weeks throughout the year with homework in between each week. There are other trainings that are available to coalitions through CATCA. As well, and a number of publications through CATCA. The Underage Drinking Enforcement Training Center has some great community assessment tools on their website under community as well as under their law enforcement links. They also have, I believe, access to some training, though I believe you have to go through your state entity to request that training at this time. So if your focus is underage drinking enforcement, know that there's some really great resources there. We also have other resources here at Drug Free Action Alliance, and you'll find some things on our website. For those within Ohio that are members of our coalition network, certainly on that member center, there's a number of toolkits and resources and trainings that we've done here in the state that are available to our members here in Ohio. For those nationally as well, we do have training opportunities. If you go to our homepage, we do this training, small and big, to a longer version. It's available as a fee-for-service training there on our homepage. If you scroll down, you'll see that icon with DFAA training opportunities. A related training to that is what used to be called SAPST, that Derek mentioned. It is now called the Substance Abuse Prevention Skills Training. I guess that still is SAPST. Building our behavioral health workforce. If you've been through SAPS years ago when it was very alcohol and drug specific, it's much more now with the substance abuse mental health crossover, and it's been very updated, and it's really a whole new curriculum. So finding some SAPS trainers in your area, or certainly here in Ohio, we can provide that to folks as well. And then I do want to mention a 2-day training that we have called Beyond Billboards. That is about using parents who host lose the most. Don't be a party to teenage drinking. That's one of our programs that we've had for many, many a year and is in almost every state now. But we want to help people really mobilize their community with that and get beyond just the billboards and brochures. And so we created a 2-day training that is based on this headset that Derek's going to flip up here for us, where we really use the SPIF as the through thread. And we walk people through a SPIF process, very condensed version of, so that they can then go back and do it in a longer version with their actual community. And they SPIF the social hosting issue, and they're taking aim at changing environmental factors like community norms, this is on the target, access and availability, media messages, policy and enforcement, those 4 main environmental factors that they take aim at. There are 7 community change strategies put out through the community toolbox that CACA and DFC grantees also use, the 7 community change or behavior change strategies. You may have seen those before. Those help to steer you to making that change on that target. That's the tool. And then the arrow that we're going to put in there is parents who host lose the most. And we use that as our example through that 2-day hands-on training, whether groups are new to parents or hosts or they've never used it before but are looking to address social hosting in their community to address underage drinking. But that arrow, any community or group or coalition or team that goes through that training learns, and it's capacity building to learn the SPIF and these 7 change strategies in camp, and they could take that arrow out and replace it with DUI or any other issue that, responsible beverage sales and service. And you can put other things in there in your community, opiate prevention, etc. So it's about learning the process, applying it to something concrete to take that project to the next level, but then being able to apply that process to other issues from that point on. So that's the goal of that training. It is a 2-day training. We do offer that as fee for service, and happy to answer questions about that via email if you have some. Derek, if you would. That also brings us to the focus of our next webinar, which is on December 11th. An email just went out with our winter lineup. December, January, February, and March webinars are now out there. You should have received an email. And the time will be the same, Eastern 1 to 2. And we will focus on an overview of that Parents Who Host project, which some of you may have heard of but never really knew what it was. So we'll get you an overview of that project. Derek.
Thank you for everyone who's joined us today. We have now got to the question and answer section of today's session. So if you do have a question, please ask it in the question section of your go-to webinar navigation panel. And while we wait for those questions to populate, I also wanted to let you know about the SurveyMonkey that we will be sent out post-session today. And we really want to get a sense of what your feedback is from this session, so we can make changes for not only next month's training, but those going forward. And we can continue to improve the services and programming that we provide you here at Drug Free Action Alliance. And because of your efforts and your feedback from last year's webinars, that's really what populated the content for this year's webinars. And the first question I have is for Janine, and her question is that she hasn't received the email for the webinar, and where can she go to register? And that is a great question. For registration, you can go to the calendar page at Drug Free Action Alliance, and all that information is posted right there of our upcoming events. So you can go to drugfreeactionalliance.org, and right there at the top of the page has information on the right-hand side for you to see what we have going on. And it'll show all of the activities that we have, and I'm pulling it up on the screen right now. So just from our home page, we can click on the calendar section up in the right-hand corner, and then that's all going to be posted there. And there was 2 other questions about the webinar, so again, those have been listed there. And is there a scheduled today training for Parents Who Host Lose the Most? For that question is from Lisa. Again, that training for Parents Who Host will be another 1-hour webinar, and for next month on December 11th. And if you're interested in that 2-day Parents Who Host Beyond Billboards training, you can contact Allison and she'll be able to assist you with information related to that. And there was a question about ethics training. Allison provides a training on ethics, and you'd be able to contract with her. That question is from Regina, and I'm not familiar with any other trainings that are happening related to ethics in the state. And we do not have one scheduled at this time. Thank you, Allison. Those are the questions that we have now. If you have additional questions, please feel free again to ask those in the questions section of the GoToWebinar navigation panel. And for other questions that you have post-call that kind of pop into your head, our contact information will be appearing on the screen as soon as GoToWebinar permits it to. And you can contact both Allison and me here at Drug Free Action Alliance at 614-540-9985. And you can contact Allison at asharer@drugfreeactionalliance.org and me, Derek, at dlongmire@drugfreeactionalliance.org. That is all the questions and time that we have now. Thank you so much for your information. Just as a reminder, the session recording link, as well as the copy of the PowerPoint slides and handouts that we had made reference to, will be emailed to you sometime early next week. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us on December 11th for our webinar and Parents Who Host, Lose the Most, Don't Be a Party to Teenage Drinking. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we'll talk to you next month. Bye-bye.